So I'm going to take you now through the process of how I do a co-construct verb chart with my students. Remember, like the blog was telling you, that this is something that I do after the kids have been introduced to it and worked with it for a little bit, and after they've worked with it without any real penalties for being inaccurate with that new tense. So what I'm going to show you today is how I help them co-construct a chart using the past tense, or in Spanish, the preterite tense. So what I ask them to do is get out their notebooks or a sheet of paper or something to take notes on. And normally what I'm doing is I am building this on the whiteboard in my classroom. So because I can't do that for you today, I'm going to just use a Google Doc, which is what I've got the screen recording right now. So one of the things that you need to know is that most often I try very hard to use the target language even for moments like this, so I try to keep it very simple. So I tell my students in the target language that I want them to draw a table in their notebooks, and they need one column for sure, and that first column is what is the action or the activity that we're going to talk about. And so they draw that column. So I'm going to go ahead and make this column a little bit longer. Well, actually, I'm not going to do that because I'm going to use tab to create new lines. So just imagine in their quadernos notes that we have created a long column here for several different verbs that we're going to demonstrate to them in the chart as we co-construct. Now, the magic of a co-construct is that you don't actually tell them what to write. You ask the right questions of them to get them to tell you what to write and how to organize it. So then we're going to create a little area that you see up here, where this is where I write to them on the board. Okay, so here's where we're going to write who we're talking about. So at this point I ask them, okay, so let's talk about who are people that we talk about in Spanish class. Again, let me remind you, all of my questions, unless I say otherwise, I want you to envision are in the target language. So I said, the very first question that I might ask my students is, who is the main person we talk about in Spanish class all the time? And no matter what class you're in, there's going to be one student who says, well, I talk about myself. And so I say, okay, how do you say I? And then they tell me, of course, yo. So we write yo in as the first person that we talk about in Spanish class. And so then I ask the question, and we're getting ready to add a new column. I ask them, so who is another person, who's the second most important person that we talk about in Spanish class? And this person is somebody we talk about especially in conversations. And so they come up with you. And then I ask them, how do you say you in Spanish? And then they tell me, of course, tú. And now I say to them, okay, well, now we need to talk about other people. And because we don't always talk about ourselves, and we don't always just talk about our partners in the conversation, we also need to be able to talk about other people. So, for example, who is an important person in your life? And a friend or a family member is something that I might add to clarify that. So then I have somebody who in the classroom who will always say, oh, well, my brother. And I'll say, okay, what's your brother's name? And the student responds, oh, my brother's name is David. Now, of course, those logistically little questions aren't exactly the same. The answers aren't always the same, but that's just an example. And I said, okay, is David a girl or a boy? And of course they come up with boy. And then I said, okay, well, David's an important person or an important guy in your life. Who is an important girl in your life? And that student or some other student might say, okay, well, my mom's an important person in my life. So then I say to them, okay, what is your mom's name? And then let's say, for example, they give me her name is Susan. And then I said, thank you. So Susan is a boy or a girl? And they come up with girl or a woman. And I said, okay, so now we have a boy who's important in our lives, and now we have a girl who's important in our lives. So what about a group of people that we are connected to? So I asked them something like, are you a part of a group of friends? And most kids will nod and say yes. And I'll say, who is this group that you're a part of that's really important to you? And they'll say something like my friends, and they'll say that in Spanish, and I say, okay, well, do you do things with them? And they'll say yes. And so, what kind of things do you do with them? And we just have a short conversation. And I said, oh, my friends are important to me too. I do lots of things with my friends. My friends and I do blank. And I'll give them an example. So then I asked the class, okay, well, my friends and I, is that an important group in my life? And get them all to agree. So we add mis amigos y yo, or my friends and I, to this chart. And then after that, I ask the question, okay, but sometimes our friends do things without us, right? And we don't get to participate, right? And they said yes, and I said, in fact, one day it was great because I had a little girl who came in and she was frustrated with her group of girlfriends who left her in the bathroom while they, proceeded to come to class. And so she came in and she just was, ragging on them and teasing them and acting like she was mad at them. And so I just started using Spanish to kind of chime in on this whole banter about sometimes your friends are your friends and sometimes they're really not, right? Sometimes they're good and sometimes they're really evil. And so we had this little conversation going on. And so I used that conversation for the purpose of our co-construct. And so I said, sometimes we talk about our friends and us because we do things together and everything's good, right, Olivia? And then Olivia was with me and she was shaking her head, yeah, see, And then I said, but sometimes we need to talk about our friends because they're bad, right, Olivia? And she said, yes. So then it allows me to put in mis amigos, if I can type, so that we can separate ourselves from a group, and there you get the main different groups of people that we talk about in our lives. Okay, so now we've got the basis of our co-construct. So what comes next is a verb. So now what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, well, one of the things that we do in life is we go places, right? But we're not talking about the present now. We're talking about the past. So, como se dice, how do you say go in the past? And so I get them to tell me in English, and so there we put in went. And so what goes into the chart comes from them, not from me. My job is just to ask the right questions. So then I ask them, all right, well, how do you say, como se dice, went for yo? And so, I let them think about it. Usually this first person is going to come really fast, so we are able to write it in quickly when somebody says fui. And so then I congratulate them, tell them how smart they are, very good. And so then I ask them, how would you say then, I have to fix that, it's going to bother me. How would you say went for two? And so they think about it a little bit, and maybe somebody says the wrong thing. I'm like, well, no, exactly, not exactly that, but something else. And we wait until somebody in the room comes up with it, and then we get fuiste. Okay? And so then I ask, all right, well then how would we say it for David? And we think a little bit, and then let them come up with boy. And then, okay, well then how would we say that for Susan? Is it different for a girl than for a boy? And then they, of course, tell me no, so we come up with boy again. And then I say, okay, well, how would we say went for my friends and I? And then, this is starting to kind of get to where they feel like it's a little bit more routine, a little bit more pattern-like. And so somebody will come up with, or guess, fuimos. They might not have even seen fuimos, but they might have just kind of put it together. And then if we've got it, we come up with, or I ask the question, well, what do you think? How would we say it for my friends, but not for me? I'm not doing this with my friends. And this is really, really powerful to have this little conversation to separate we from they, because in a proficiency-based classroom, I find that kids really struggle with those plural forms because they don't get to interact with them as much because they're so busy talking about themselves. So this allows us to talk about the difference between we versus they without having just to stick to the personal pronouns, which we often teach. So now, after a while, if they get it, I put it in. If not, then I suggest it to them at this point, because now I realize that we have a gap that we need to fill. So now I'll put it in if we need to. And then look, okay, so look, we've got went for everybody that we need to talk about. So then we go to a new verb. And then we go through the whole process all over again. And so I try to do a mixture of different types of verbs so that the kids can see what are the main ones that we need, that we use all the time, what are some examples of some normal, regular verbs that we need. And so another one that we might need is maybe said, because said is something that we say a lot in our conversations. So then we go through that, I ask them all the same questions, and then we come up with the verb, and they give it to me. So how would you say said for tú if dije is for yo? And so then we just build it together. And I do the cleanup work in the background. So let's say, for example, that the kid, I ask my students, okay, how would you say said for he or she? Well, probably they've picked this up from their reading. So I'll go ahead and plug that in. And then they tell me again that for a girl it's not any different, so we have dijo again. And then they start making guesses about the plural. So I'll say, okay, how would you say that my friends and I said something? And then they look at fuimos and they try to kind of make sense of it, so they probably will come up with dijimos. So what I'm getting them to do is leverage one verb against the other so that they can come up with their own conjugations. And when they're wrong, it's like, really good, thanks for trying. Let's see if we can clean that up a little bit, is what I say to them, and see if somebody else has got it. And if not, that gives me the opportunity to step in and fill in that gap, which is probably what's going to happen here with dijeron. And so then that's when I put it in. So my actual work co-constructing this with them is very minimal in comparison to what they have to do to help me build it. So that's just an idea or an example of how I would co-construct. There would be a lot more to this chart as we go along, because I want to have different examples of different high-frequency verbs, but that's the process of co-constructing a verb chart, so that we're cleaning up what they know about verbs and about a new tense, with them and their prior knowledge doing the work for them.